The desert wind carried more than heat on May 13, 1943. It carried the sound of surrender. Outside Tunis, Karl-Heinz Müller, an Obergefreiter of the Afrika Korps, watched as the last formations laid down their rifles. The barrels clanged against each other like church bells tolling for a fallen faith. Dust clung to every surface, their uniforms sun-bleached, boots split open, skin leathered by weeks of retreat. When the American patrol arrived, they expected snarling victors. Instead, the GIs offered canteens of cold water. It was not mercy Karl-Heinz expected, but something stranger, efficiency wrapped in casual confidence. By that week's end, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers were in Allied custody. Entire divisions had vanished into the sand. What staggered the prisoners most was not defeat itself. They knew their supply lines had been collapsing, but the way Americans seemed to feed and move armies with the ease of a farmer watering fields. German rations had dwindled to thin barley soup, cigarettes rolled from newspaper scraps. Now, waiting at a makeshift collection point, Karl-Heinz saw something inconceivable. Refrigerated Coca-Cola trucks parked beside rows of olive-drab Studebaker transports. The labels gleamed red under the North African sun, proof that the enemy could bring luxury into a war zone as if it were nothing. He thought of Germany, where his mother queued for bread rations measured in ounces. Here, Americans passed candy bars to prisoners almost as an afterthought. The contrast cut sharper than humiliation. If they could spare chocolate for enemies, what could they provide for their own troops? The larger picture was invisible to him, but obvious to historians. The Allies had turned the Mediterranean into a conveyor belt. By spring 1943, Liberty ships were offloading 14,000 tons of supplies daily into North African ports. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle had achieved a tempo of war production that dwarfed anything the Reich had imagined. One plant in Michigan produced more trucks in a month than Germany built in an entire year of war. Karl-Heinz could not have known the numbers, but he could smell the gasoline and fresh rubber on convoys stretching past the horizon. He boarded the train of captured men in silence. Around him, comrades speculated on their fate. Slave labor in Siberia, starvation camps in America. None could picture what waited across the ocean. Karl-Heinz pressed his forehead to the window frame, catching the last flickers of desert light. Defeat had a taste, brine, sweat, and the metallic tang of surrender. But in the distance, the silhouettes of American trucks raised a different question. Could a nation that produced so much ever truly be beaten? The question lingered as the train pulled away, bound for a port, bound for an unknown captivity. The RMS Queen Mary once carried Hollywood stars across the Atlantic. Now she carried the defeated. In June 1943, her decks groaned under the weight of more than 15,000 German prisoners guarded by American MPs. Karl-Heinz found himself pressed against the bulkhead of a cavernous dining hall converted into a dormitory, hammocks swaying in rows like cocoons. The ship vibrated with constant motion, turbines pushing her east at 28 knots, too fast for U-boats to catch. That speed alone seemed like sorcery. Germany's newest liners could barely reach 20. The voyage was less punishment than revelation. Meals came twice a day, meat stew, white bread, coffee strong enough to sting the tongue. Red Cross representatives inspected conditions, clipboards in hand, as if the enemy's welfare was a logistical checklist. Karl-Heinz's friend whispered that it was a trick, that starvation would follow once the inspectors left. But day after day, the food remained. Guards moved among them with quiet discipline, rifles slung but not brandished. When one prisoner collapsed from seasickness, an American medic knelt to check his pulse before tending to his own men. Above deck, the Atlantic stretched like hammered steel. At night, blackout curtains sealed the portholes, but still Karl-Heinz could feel the enormity of movement. This single ship carried more men in one crossing than his entire regiment had at full strength. Multiply that by dozens of vessels, and the numbers became staggering. By mid-1943, American shipyards launched a Liberty ship every 3 days. Some weeks, it was every 2. Entire German flotillas could not sink cargo as fast as America built it. Rumors spread below decks. They were bound not for England or Canada, but for America itself. At first, no one believed it. Transporting tens of thousands across an ocean simply to house them sounded impossible. Yet the facts spoke otherwise. The Queen Mary herself was proof of abundance, her hull painted battleship gray, still steaming as if wartime service were just another luxury cruise. One night, Karl-Heinz crept to the rail with permission. The ocean air was bracing, salt stinging his nose. He looked back at the wake, 2 white trails stretching unbroken behind them. He realized in that moment the futility of imagining Germany catching up. America had not only ships but oceans to hide them in, production so vast it erased risk. When the coast finally appeared, mist breaking to reveal the faint outline of the Statue of Liberty, the prisoners stared in silence. This was not the Siberian nightmare they had feared. It was something stranger, something harder to hate. Karl-Heinz's stomach tightened as the Queen Mary slowed into harbor. The land of his captors awaited, and already it felt less like punishment than a riddle he could not yet solve. The whistle of a Frisco train echoed through Aliceville, Alabama, on June 2nd, 1943. Steam hissed into the sticky air as German prisoners stepped down onto the red dirt. Karl-Heinz Müller blinked against the sunlight. The humidity clung to his skin like wet wool. The air smelled of pine resin and honeysuckle, thick and foreign after months of desert dust. Rows of barbed wire glinted ahead, enclosing a city of wood-frame barracks newly built in orderly grids. At first glance, it looked like every other prison camp he had imagined: fences, guard towers, floodlights. But as the column marched inside, surprises appeared. The barracks were fresh, the floors swept clean, mattresses stacked neatly on iron frames. In the distance, smoke curled from a mess hall chimney. Within the hour, trays of white bread, butter, and steaming meat stew were served. The prisoners exchanged wary glances. Back home, their families were scraping for turnips. Here they ate like soldiers still in the field. For the townsfolk of Aliceville, the sight was harder to swallow. Clara Davis, a widow with 2 sons in the army, had come to watch the Germans arrive. She heard neighbors mutter that the Krauts would live better than ration book Americans. Coffee was scarce in town, sugar scarcer still, yet the government promised prisoners the same diet as U.S. troops. Geneva Convention rules, explained the papers. Clara's jaw tightened as she thought of her eldest fighting in Italy, while these men queued for seconds. Inside the wire, Karl-Heinz absorbed the order of it all. Inspections were efficient, rules firm but not cruel. Guards stood at ease more often than at attention, as if secure in strength too vast to be threatened. He noticed details: the sheen of new trucks parked nearby, the hum of generators powering electric lights at night, the casual way guards smoked Lucky Strikes without counting their last pack. Every gesture spoke of a country so wealthy it could afford generosity. That evening, as the Alabama twilight painted the camp gold, an older prisoner muttered, "Paradise on earth." The phrase carried irony, but it stuck. Behind the wire, men compared stew portions to their last rations in Tunisia. They marveled at hot showers, clean uniforms, the chance to write letters home. Paradise or prison? Both could be true at once. Karl-Heinz lay awake on his bunk, listening to cicadas chirr in the humid dark. He thought of the Reich's posters promising victory through discipline and sacrifice. Here, in enemy hands, victory seemed to come from something else entirely: organization, abundance, and a calm assurance that no shortage would ever come. Morning in Camp Aliceville began with the clang of a triangle bell and the smell of fried eggs. Prisoners lined up in ranks, not for forced labor, but for breakfast served on steel trays. Karl Heinz studied the portions: eggs, bread, a slab of bacon. It was more meat in one meal than he'd seen in weeks before capture. Later he learned this was regulation. American rations for POWs had to equal those of U.S.-based troops. The rule was bureaucratic, but the effect was transformative. Life inside the wire settled into rhythm. Work details rotated between the laundry, kitchen, and maintenance shops. For each day, POWs earned 80 cents in camp scrip, paper money redeemable only at the canteen. Soon Karl Heinz held his first chit in his hand, marveling at the idea that an enemy soldier could be paid. At the canteen, he traded it for a Hershey bar, unwrapped it slowly, and tasted chocolate sweeter than anything Germany could have spared since 1939. Captain Robert Ellis, the camp commandant, walked the perimeter often, clipboard under his arm. He enforced discipline firmly, but without cruelty. He understood the Geneva Convention as both a duty and a strategic necessity. American POWs in German hands depended on reciprocity. Yet Ellis also noticed the way townspeople bristled. Mothers with ration books couldn't buy butter, while the prisoners' mess hall always seemed stocked. Some evenings, locals gathered outside the fence just to watch soccer games the Germans played, astonished at the cheering crowds and the vitality of men who had once marched for Hitler. The camp became a community. Orchestras formed, instruments issued from storage. A violinist performed Bach in the recreation hall, his bow strokes carrying across the Alabama night. Soccer teams clashed on makeshift fields, their shouts echoing against the wire. A prisoner who had studied engineering in Munich began teaching English classes. University of Alabama professors came to lecture. To the Germans, it felt like a strange inversion. Captured soldiers becoming students and musicians, their enemy providing the stage. But the cage was real. Towers loomed at each corner, and at night, searchlights swept the grounds with mechanical precision. Freedom was a horizon beyond the wire, visible but unreachable. Still, the paradox defined their days: luxury within limits, abundance wrapped in captivity. One evening, Karl Heinz sat on the barracks steps, watching the orchestra tune up. The notes floated into the humid dusk, mingling with the drone of cicadas. He realized he was humming along. It was then he understood why the phrase "paradise on earth" spread so quickly among prisoners. They had lost the war, but stumbled into a world that revealed just how far behind their nation had fallen. The Kansas wind cut like a blade across the fields, carrying dust and the sharp scent of cut corn. By late summer 1943, Karl Heinz Müller found himself far from Alabama, reassigned to a work detachment in the Great Plains. Instead of guard towers and barracks, his mornings began with the rumble of flatbed trucks rolling through endless farmland. The men dismounted into the glare of open sky, handed tools instead of rifles. For Clara Davis, the widow who managed her family's acreage with the help of hired hands, the arrival of German prisoners was unsettling. She still remembered the telegram that confirmed her eldest was fighting in Italy. Now enemy soldiers hoed her fields and loaded her grain. At first she refused to speak to them, wary of the blue-gray uniforms marked with PW, yet she could not deny their discipline. The Germans worked in silence, precise in their movements, stacking sacks as if marching in formation. One afternoon, Clara walked behind the rows of corn, listening to the scrape of hoes and the murmur of foreign words. She noticed their glances toward the highway, where convoys of olive-drab trucks thundered past in endless procession, new, gleaming, with tires that smelled of fresh rubber. To the POWs, it was a revelation. In Germany, trucks were rationed like gold. Divisions fought over broken-down lorries. Here, America fielded so many that surplus convoys seemed to idle at crossroads for hours. Karl Heinz whispered to a fellow prisoner, "They waste more here than we ever had." He wasn't wrong. By 1943, American factories in Detroit produced more trucks in a single month than the entire Wehrmacht assembled in a year. One plant rolled out a finished vehicle every 5 minutes. The numbers were beyond comprehension, but the evidence was on the road. Convoys that never seemed to end. When work paused at noon, Clara carried a jug of water to the field. She noticed how the men handled it with ritual care, passing it in silence, each sip deliberate. Hunger lingered in their eyes even after hearty rations. She realized then that they were not monsters, but boys, many younger than her sons, who had been told lies about America's weakness. Watching their faces as another convoy roared past, she saw disbelief harden into reluctant awe. At sundown, the prisoners climbed back onto their trucks, the sky streaked red and gold. Karl-Heinz glanced one last time at the highway, still humming with vehicles. The war felt decided not by battles but by machinery, by the simple fact that America could build more trucks than Germany could destroy. As Clara closed the gate behind them, she felt a strange unease. If America's abundance impressed the enemy this deeply, what would it mean when her sons returned home? The sun was dipping behind the Alabama pines when Private First Class Sam Gutierrez leaned against the wooden rail of a watchtower, rifle slung casually across his shoulder. At 19, he had expected war to mean foxholes and firefights. Instead, his service meant overseeing men who once wore the eagle and swastika on their collars. He listened to their voices drifting upward, German folk songs sung in harmony as twilight settled over Camp Aliceville. Sam was the son of Mexican immigrants, raised in the dry fields of South Texas. At home, prejudice was as common as dust storms. Now he wore the uniform of the United States Army, guarding men who once believed themselves a master race. The irony was not lost on him. He studied their faces during roll call, sunburned, tired, but not broken. They saluted their officers even inside captivity, clinging to the fragments of a discipline that had carried them across half the world. Yet captivity softened edges. Sam saw it in small gestures. Prisoners sketching portraits of guards, sharing jokes in broken English, clapping when a soccer goal split the net. He had once feared them as monsters, but here they were, musicians and mechanics, trading script for cigarettes in the canteen. When a violinist played Bach under the recreation hall lights, Sam leaned against the doorway, surprised at how the music stirred him. Still, discipline remained paramount. Orders from Captain Ellis emphasized that Geneva Convention standards were not generosity, but duty. Each prisoner received the same rations as American troops, a fact Sam repeated often to locals who muttered about coddling Nazis. The Guard force itself was a cross-section of America. Farm boys from Iowa, clerks from New Jersey, sons of immigrants like Sam. It struck him that democracy's strength lay in this very mix, while the men inside the wire represented a nation that demanded sameness. During one humid evening patrol, Sam heard a POW humming. Without thinking, he joined in, adding a Spanish verse to the German melody. The prisoner smiled, surprised but not hostile. In that moment, Sam realized something profound. Freedom sounded the same in any language, but the wires still stood. Guards rotated with precision. Searchlights swept the yard. Rifles gleamed under moonlight. Mercy did not erase vigilance. Sam understood that paradise for the prisoners was still prison. Yet in their songs and smiles, he caught glimpses of something larger, the quiet triumph of a system that could hold its enemies firmly, feed them well, and still demand nothing in return but order. As he descended the tower at shift's end, the notes of the song still lingered. Sam carried them with him, a reminder that America's true strength was not just in the trucks and planes rolling off assembly lines, but in the humanity it preserved even in victory. The night of November 4th, 1943, was cool in Oklahoma, the prairie wind rattling the tin roofs of Camp Tonkawa. Inside Barracks 8, however, the air was thick with tension. Gefreiter Johannes Kunze had been marked. Fellow prisoners whispered he was an informant, a man who passed details of escape talk to the Americans. In the hierarchy of die-hard Nazis, betrayal was the blackest sin. That night, the whispers became fists. Karl-Heinz Müller was not there, but he heard the thud of blows carried across the yard, a sickening rhythm muffled by wooden walls. By dawn, Kunze lay lifeless, his skull fractured. It was the first time many realized paradise had cracks. The U.S. Army could provide hot meals, soccer fields, and even violins, but it could not banish ideology. Within the wire, Hitler's grip lingered, sustained by men who feared losing their identity more than their freedom. Captain Robert Ellis studied the reports with grim resolve. Geneva Convention obligations required that crimes among prisoners be prosecuted with the same severity as American cases. Military police launched investigations, interrogated witnesses, and within months, 5 POWs were tried by court-martial. The proceedings were precise, each step logged. When the verdict came, guilty of murder, the sentence was death. On July 10, 1945, the condemned men were hanged at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The executions made clear that America's mercy was not weakness, and order would not bend to ideology. For Sam Gutierrez, still guarding back in Aliceville, the story spread like wildfire. Some prisoners murmured admiration for their comrades' discipline. Others were shaken to the core, realizing they could be killed not by Americans but by their own. The camp orchestra still played on Saturday nights, but shadows hung heavier over the music. The impossible statistic came not in death tolls, but in restraint. Out of 425,000 Axis prisoners held in the United States, incidents of violence were extraordinarily rare. Kunze's murder became infamous precisely because it was the exception. American abundance and strict Geneva compliance had drained away most reasons for unrest. Where other nations' camps brimmed with starvation and revolt, the United States managed to house an army larger than the Wehrmacht had in France, without chaos. Still, for Karl-Heinz, the illusion of paradise was forever altered. He understood now that captivity carried risks beyond hunger or humiliation. It was a reminder that ideology, once planted, could poison even fertile soil. He sat on his bunk that evening, staring at the script chit in his hand, wondering how a nation that could outproduce Germany 100-fold also seemed to command a deeper order, an order capable of punishing even its prisoners by its own laws. The cicadas buzzed outside, indifferent, while the floodlights carved sharp lines against the Oklahoma dark. December 23, 1944, Papago Park, Arizona. The desert night was brittle with cold, stars scattering across a sky so vast it seemed endless. 25 German prisoners wriggled out of a tunnel lined with scavenged crate boards, their breath puffing in white clouds as they crawled into the open. They carried homemade compasses, maps drawn from memory, and a dream of freedom. Mexico lay less than 200 miles south. The plan had been simple on paper. Slip through the tunnel, reach the Salt River, and float on improvised rafts downstream into the Gila, then the Colorado, and finally into Mexico. What they had not reckoned with was Arizona's winter reality. When they reached the riverbed, it was dry, just gravel and frozen sand glinting under moonlight. Their rafts scraped uselessly across stone. Still, they trudged onward, boots crunching frost, each mile heavier than the last. Back at camp, guards discovered the escape by dawn. Captain Ellis, briefed via teleprinter, knew the desert itself was the best ally. American patrols fanned out quickly, armed with jeeps and radios. By contrast, the fugitives had only their feet and their illusions. Days turned to weeks, but the outcome was inevitable. The irony came not with their capture, but with their surrender. Some fugitives, starving and shivering, walked straight into diners along the roadside. One group gave up after smelling hamburgers sizzling on a grill. Another was found curled beside an irrigation ditch, too cold to move. The escape ended not in triumph, but in sheepish returns. By January 28, 1945, every one of the 25 had been recaptured. For Karl-Heinz, still in Aliceville, the story was told with equal parts admiration and ridicule. The bravery to attempt it was undeniable. Yet what struck him most was how swiftly abundance undid desperation. In Germany, men could fight on black bread for weeks. In America, escapees surrendered for the promise of a hot meal. The impossible statistic loomed again. America's home front was so saturated with resources that even fugitives could not outlast its excess. At peak, U.S. shipyards were launching a Liberty ship every 2 days, an ocean of steel and food that dwarfed the Reich's dwindling supplies. The escape attempt became a metaphor, proof that ideology faltered not against bullets but against hamburgers and neon-lit diners. When the last fugitive was marched back through Papago's gates, guards shook their heads. There had been no gunfire, no bloodshed, only the desert's cold truth and America's endless plenty. For the prisoners, paradise was once again prison, but a prison that revealed in its very comforts why the war was already lost. The projector rattled in the recreation hall, its beam cutting through smoke and dust. German prisoners crowded shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, eyes fixed on the flickering black and white images. On screen, fleets of B-29 superfortresses gleamed under Pacific sunlight, their 4 Wright R-3350 engines roaring as they lifted into formation. For Karl-Heinz Müller, the sight was staggering. He had known aircraft, Junkers Ju-80s, Messerschmitt Bf-19s, but nothing like this. The Americans did not build planes. They birthed them in swarms. The numbers were whispered before the film began, passed along like campfire rumors. By 1944, American factories had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. In Seattle, a single Boeing plant turned out B-17 at a rate of 1 every hour. In Michigan, the Willow Run plant rolled Liberator bombers off its mile-long assembly line, a cathedral of steel and rivets. It was production on a scale the Reich could not comprehend, let alone match. Karl-Heinz listened as a guard explained the specs to another prisoner. Wingspan of 141 feet, a bomb load of 20,000 pounds, ceiling of 31,000 feet. The numbers were as heavy as the bombs themselves. Each B-29 cost millions, yet here were hundreds filling the screen. To the Germans, who counted every liter of fuel, it was like watching an avalanche in slow motion, unstoppable, grinding, inevitable. Captain Ellis stood at the back, arms folded. He allowed the screenings not to taunt, but to educate. If the prisoners could see with their own eyes what American industry accomplished, perhaps they would understand the futility of further resistance. Ellis knew that wars ended not only on battlefields but in the minds of men. Even Sam Gutierrez, leaning against the wall, felt a swell of pride. He thought of his father back in Texas, working 12-hour shifts at a defense plant. Every rivet driven there ended up in the sky over Europe or the Pacific. Sam realized that the orchestra concerts and soccer matches inside the wire were only possible because outside it, America's machine kept churning without pause. When the reel ended, silence filled the hall. No one jeered, no one applauded. Karl-Heinz lowered his eyes, suddenly aware of the Hershey wrapper in his pocket, the steady meals, the humming generators. It all added up to a truth too big to deny. The Reich had lost not just battles, but the race of production. He stepped out into the Alabama night. The cicadas sang, and the air smelled of honeysuckle and diesel. For the first time, Karl-Heinz admitted what he had resisted for months. Germany could never catch up. America's avalanche of steel, bread, and ships had already buried the Reich. May 8, 1945. The camp loudspeakers crackled with static before the words came. Germany had surrendered. In Aliceville, prisoners gathered in stunned clusters, heads bowed, hands shoved deep into pockets. Some wept openly, others stood rigid, as if carved from stone. Karl-Heinz sat on a barrack step, staring at the dirt between his boots. The war he had marched into as a boy was over, and he had lived to hear it announced by his captors. The Americans did not gloat. Captain Ellis ordered the flag raised at half-mast, not for the enemy's defeat, but for the dead of both nations. Guards continued their shifts. Meals were served as usual. That evening, the orchestra played Beethoven's Eroica, the notes rising over barbed wire under a twilight sky. Even Sam Gutierrez, leaning on his rifle, felt the weight of the music. He thought of friends lost in the Pacific, of cousins buried in Italy, of the victory telegrams that would never reach some homes. For Clara Davis, back in Kansas, the news came over the radio in her kitchen. She set down the dish rag, hands trembling as the announcer's voice confirmed what she had prayed for. Her eldest son would be coming home. Outside her window, POWs still worked the fields, gathering the wheat that fed both Americans and their enemies. The paradox was not lost on her. The same men who had fought her boy in Tunisia were now helping sustain the victory that ended the war. Inside the camp, emotions fractured. Some prisoners feared repatriation to Soviet zones, where captivity meant starvation. Others clung to the hope of returning to families alive beneath Allied bombs. For Karl-Heinz, it was more complicated. He had glimpsed a country that fought with factories as much as rifles, that fed its prisoners with better meals than his family had seen in years. If this was the enemy, then everything he had been taught about weakness was a lie. The impossible statistic hovered over the moment like a shadow. America had housed 425,000 German prisoners in 700 camps across 46 states while still fighting on 2 continents. Not one Allied offensive had been slowed for lack of resources. Feeding and sheltering an enemy army would have bankrupted Germany. For America, it was a footnote. As night fell, Karl-Heinz walked to the fence. He pressed his palm to the cool wire and listened to the orchestra's last notes fade into silence. Behind him, men shuffled back to their barracks. Ahead of him, beyond the wire, was a nation whose strength had ended his war without ever breaking a sweat. The whistle blew again in Aliceville in September 1945, but this time the sound carried a different weight. The war was over, and the trains waited not to deliver, but to depart. Columns of German prisoners, duffels slung across shoulders, marched toward the platforms under watchful guard. The same tracks that had brought them into captivity would now carry them eastward, bound for staging areas and, eventually, home. Karl-Heinz Müller tightened his grip on a canvas sack filled with mementos. A dog-eared English primer, a small sketch he had traded from a fellow prisoner, and one final script chit he had never redeemed. He moved slowly, eyes scanning the familiar skyline of the camp. Guard towers, mess halls, barracks that had become strange homes. For 2 years, paradise had been bounded by barbed wire. Now freedom lay ahead, and it frightened him. Outside the fence, townsfolk gathered to watch. Clara Davis stood among them, hands folded. She remembered the resentment she'd once felt, watching prisoners eat meat while her own table went without. But she also remembered their discipline in the fields, the way one had bowed politely when she brought water, the way they marveled at convoys on the highway. She caught Karl-Heinz's eye as he passed and offered a nod. He returned it with a faint smile, acknowledgement that enemies had become something more complex. The logistics of departure were staggering. Moving hundreds of thousands of POWs required coordination across states, rail lines, ports, and ships. Yet the American system managed it with the same efficiency that had built bombers and trucks. Each prisoner was catalogued, processed, and assigned. For a nation that had housed an army of enemies while waging total war abroad, the challenge was only another timetable to master. At the station, Karl-Heinz climbed aboard. The train lurched forward, wheels screeching against the rails. He pressed his forehead to the window, just as he had done years before in North Africa, but the view was different now. Rows of cotton stretched into the distance, telephone lines cutting the horizon, billboards advertising Coca-Cola in bright paint. Abundance was everywhere. As the camp receded, he reached into his pocket and felt the crumpled chit. Worthless outside the fence, it had become a symbol, a reminder that his captors had paid him not with cruelty, but with wages, however modest. He resolved to keep it, not as currency, but as proof that the war had been lost to more than bullets. The train gathered speed. The land of captivity faded behind him, but its lessons clung like the Alabama humidity. He had seen what democracy could build when it armed itself with factories and fairness. The Reich had promised glory. America had shown reality. Years later, in the 1950s, Karl-Heinz stood in a rebuilt German town square, holding his daughter's hand. The war was over, the rubble cleared, but memories of America remained sharper than the ruins. When she asked about the faded script chit he kept in a tin box, he told her it was from Paradise on Earth, the phrase whispered among prisoners who never forgot their captivity. He explained how thousands of men had been captured in Tunisia, shipped across the ocean, and housed in camps that offered not starvation, but symphonies. He described the soccer games under Alabama skies, the Hershey bars bought with play money, the hot showers after years of dust. His daughter listened wide-eyed, unable to imagine enemy soldiers being treated so well. But Karl-Heinz knew it had not been kindness alone. It was power, pure and unshakable. He told her of the convoys of trucks that stretched beyond sight, of the Liberty ships launched every 2 days, of the 300,000 aircraft that filled Allied skies. He explained that America could afford to treat its enemies with dignity because it had resources to spare. Mercy was not weakness. It was the confidence of abundance. Historians later confirmed what he felt in his bones. At its peak, the United States housed 425,000 German prisoners in 700 camps across 46 states, feeding and clothing them while simultaneously defeating Japan and Germany on opposite sides of the globe. Any other nation would have collapsed under the strain. For America, it was a logistical achievement woven seamlessly into victory. Clara Davis would remember the day POWs left her farm, how silence settled over the fields without their steady rhythm. Sam Gutierrez would remember the songs drifting up to his tower, the night he joined a German melody with his own Spanish verse. Captain Ellis would remember balancing the scales of order and mercy, ensuring America's promise to its prisoners was kept. And Karl-Heinz would remember the night he realized the Reich was finished, not by battlefield defeat alone, but by the impossible arithmetic of production and freedom. In time, some former POWs returned as immigrants, seeking the abundance they had glimpsed behind barbed wire. Others carried stories that softened enmity across oceans. The legacy of those camps was not merely survival, but transformation, proof that democracy's strength lay not only in bombs and bullets, but in bread and fairness. Karl-Heinz placed the chit back in its tin box. To him, it was more than paper. It was the evidence of a truth that modern generations still struggled to grasp. America had beaten tyranny not only with firepower, but with generosity, revealing that true power is the ability to feed one's enemies and still win the war.